So you've decided to conjure a dream army of lizards after licking a suspicious looking frog. Who hasn't? In this video I'm going to walk you through how to play Seraphon in Age of Sigmar's diminutive cousin Warcry. Seraphon are a mix of dinosaurs, lizards, frogs, and all of the above riding, well, all of the above. Seraphon are one of the largest warbands in Warcry as of recording, and this is for good reason. Games Workshop forgot to remove a bunch of them when adding in their replacements. But that's okay, we can forgive them because overall, Seraphon are pretty darn solid. As a faction, they have access to just about everything anyone would ever want to make a warband. And since they are part of the Order Grand Alliance, the extra sauce you might want to spruce things up are easily allied in. That's not to say that they don't have flaws, because we will get to them, but those flaws are largely offset by having big dinosaurs and little dinosaurs in equal measure. Kicking off our guide, we will look at their battle trait, and frankly, this is one of the more underrated traits in the game. Uniquely, this trait actually has two traits nestled within. Coalesced is all about dealing more damage. Friendly fighters with this battle trait can add 1 to the value of any triple spent to use the Tearing Bite ability, up until a maximum of 6. Starborn with an E, on the other hand, is all about not dying. Fighters with this battle trait can make their Starborn without an E reaction when they are targeted by melee and ranged attack actions. Starting with Coalesced, this basically allows you to add an additional point of damage to most of your Tearing Bites. Considering Tearing Bite is one of the best abilities in Seraphon, making it pop off with higher damage is always a good thing. This is typically the trait you will pick when playing Seraphon all in faction. That being said, don't ignore Starborn. Looking at the Starborn reaction, this allows you to downgrade 2 critical hits to regular hits in melee. Extending that to range attacks is potentially huge depending on what you are fighting against. The very best ranged units in the game can do devastating amounts of damage when they land those crits. We are talking 6 to 8 damage a pop, and those hits will kill your guys pretty darn fast. Being able to slash that damage in a pinch makes the Seraphon incredibly difficult to shift. So which do you take? Well, you take the one that makes the most sense. In most situations, you will just take Coalesced, since that's the one that will always see some value. However, if you are expecting heavy firepower, then Starborn is an incredible boost to your defense and makes reactions like Take Cover look like complete pants. Since I have already touched on their reaction, I will move straight onto units and cover any abilities that those units have, as in when they crop up, starting with the Saurus Scar-Veteran on Aggradon. This lad is the big cheese, the king of the jungle, the big dinosaur riding an even bigger dinosaur, and he rocks in at 295 points. He isn't cheap, but he does pack quite a respectable stat line. Movement 8, toughness 4, 30 wounds, 4 attacks, strength 5, and 3/5 damage at 1 inch range. Now, he does come with the mounted rune mark, making that movement 8 slightly harder for him to get around the battlefield, but if you want a big, nasty, smashy mobility piece, you don't get much bigger or meaner or smashier than this lad. He will mince through most things that he touches just with his raw stats, but be aware that wounds 30 and toughness 4 will only get you so far when it comes to survival. This guy is deceptively squishy, and if you throw him around all willy-nilly, he will go down fast. He may be priced like a Varangard, but he isn't taking hits like one, that is for sure. Now, when it comes to abilities, the Scar-Veteran comes with 4. First, you have Cold-Blooded Commander, and this is the Seraphon generic hero double. Basically, if you get a kill, you can move or you can attack again. This is a pretty standard ability in Warcry, but it is one that you'll be popping off constantly with the Scar-Veteran. Being able to blend through chaff and then bounce into something else and then blend through them makes it far harder for enemies to bog your guy down. And when it comes to raw damage output, being able to potentially cut through 3 models a turn is always a good thing. Anyone who has played with or against Seraphon know what's up. Next, of course, we are talking about Tearing Bite. This is the big damage amplifier that we all know and love. All you do is add the value of a triple to the damage and critical damage of your next melee attack action, potentially pushing this guy to a 911 damage profile, which is especially bonkers when you consider he has 4 attacks at a decent strength. If you want something to die, this guy will definitely kill it. That being said, the Scar-Veteran has such good damage output at base, you are likely better off just using this on something that does less damage per swing, but still has a high volume of attacks, something like a standard Saurus. Next up, we have Predatory Leap, which allows the Scar-Veteran to make a 3-inch bonus move action with Fly. You will then do half the dice value worth of damage if you land within 1 inch of an enemy. This ability is situational but great. Being able to make bonus move actions is always good as it allows you to close the distance without burning actual actions. And the added damage is also nice too, making the Scar-Veteran ideal for picking off the last few wounds on an injured enemy. Finally, we have the Seraphon generic quad, Wrath of the Old Ones. Until the end of the battle round, add half the dice value to your strength and attacks when making melee attack actions. This is situationally better than Rampage. Lots of attacks at a high strength means you will likely eat through anything you are already in combat with. That being said, if you have to move, then Rampage is probably the better option. Overall, the Scar-Veteran is a solid pick. He is expensive, the most expensive thing you can take, but he's the fastest and most damaging piece that you have access to. There are cheaper options within the roster, but the Scar-Vet is the king if you're willing to pay his premium. Moving on to the Slann Starmaster, and boy howdy, this guy has a reputation. The Slann is a menace of a range unit, 12 inches, no minimum range, 3-4-3-6, movement 4 with fly, toughness 4, 32 wounds for 265 points. This guy is the real deal. This throne-bound frog is more than capable of controlling the entire board with his incredible damage output and deceptive durability. Throw in the fact that he has access to Cold-Blooded Commander for additional actions on kill, and the Slann can reliably kill 2 to 3 models per turn from 12 inches away. The only real downside to the Slann is his massive base size. This thing is huge, and even with fly you will struggle to get this lad across a terrain dense board. Not only that, but his fantastic range profile can lead to some greedy plays. As much as you want to be firing all game long, you really want him to be on the move early to get into a better firing position. Keeping him stationary for too long in the early game will come and bite you in the ass if you are not careful. Central and elevated is the ideal location. The Slann also comes with a very powerful and underused triple called Lords of Space and Time, allowing the Slann to teleport models to him. Now, it does have some problematic restrictions, namely the distance you can place the model you are teleporting from the Slann is dice dependent and restricted to being wholly within, but a high triple allows you to grab basically anything from 12 inches away and plonk them within a reasonable distance. This is great for getting your big hitters into combat without them moving or manipulating objective control or escaping with treasure tokens. Overall, the Slann is fantastic. You will ideally bless his range attack with +1 strength so he can kill more reliably, but it's not required. As a control piece, very few things can compete against the Slann. This guy just controls so much of the board, and stepping into its range is a death sentence for most things, especially chaff, mid-range and other wizards. Moving on to Aggradon Lancer Alphas, we have 2. The club deals more damage, the spear has more ranged, and I don't like either. For 235 to 245 points, they are just okay. 25 wounds, strength 4, 4 attacks. These are fine stats. I can't really knock them for that, but when compared to other units in the warband, you can spend more and get the Scar-Veteran, who will do a lot more, or a fair chunk less, and get something that operates just as effectively. They have the same abilities as the Scar-Veteran on Aggradon, but that doesn't really make them great, nor does it really make them worth taking. But if I was forced to take one, I would likely take the club. I am going to combine the next two together, the Ripperdactyl Chief and the Ripperdactyl Alpha. The Chief is 15 points more, but gets plus 5 wounds, which is not a bad trade-off. Beyond that, they both have a 4-4-2-4 profile, movement 10 with fly, and toughness 4. For their cost, these are fine. They are incredibly fast with fly and movement 10, so they can zip around the board and do basically anything you want them to do. This is great for bullying chaff, taking objectives, and generally being a nuisance, and 20 to 25 wounds is chunky enough to take a hit. I mean, the Ripperdactyl Chief, despite being a skink on a fairly flimsy bird, is just as hard to kill as in Aggradon Lancer Alpha in every regard. Now, unlike their Saurus brothers, Ripperdactyls and their skink riders do not have access to tearing bite like the Aggradons, but they do have voracious appetite, which will deal a little bit of chip damage on a 4+, which isn't too bad on a double. These things are not going to be bursting down big things or taking massive shots from titans, but they are going to go everywhere your opponent doesn't want them to be, and they're going to do work when they get there. For their cost, they are very comparable to other flyers in other warbands, and Cold-Blooded Commander also makes them very effective as hit-and-run units. Fly in, get a cheeky kill on some chaff or a weakened unit, fly back out, done and dusted. Pterodon Chiefs and Alphas, on the other hand, take the Ripperdactyl, make them slightly squishier, but ramp up their speed even more. And not only that, the Alphas are a lot cheaper. That being said though, I don't like the Pterodons as much. Even for their reduced cost, the sacrifices the Alphas make to their offensive output and durability is significant, and their unique abilities don't really fix that. Being able to add 3 to their already insane movement isn't all that interesting, and doing flat dice damage on a triple is nice, but not something that sells me on the unit as a whole. Now, as a quick tangent, we aren't very far into this video and we've already stumbled across a fair amount of redundancy. With 3 Aggradons and 5 flying skinks, I can't help but feel they could have refined this list a little bit, especially when I'm not a massive fan of 2/3 of the Aggradons and 3/5 of the flyers so far. Don't worry, there are a lot more flyers and dinosaurs riding dinosaurs to add to this redundancy. Speaking of which, we now get onto the great invalidators, the Scar-Veteran on Cold One and the Saurus Knight Alpha. For 215 or 195 points, you get 2 durable, decently fast mounted units who can tearing bite, have access to predatory leap, and pack a decent chunk of wounds and damage. Considering you are saving 80 to 100 points on a Scar-Veteran on Aggradon and not losing all that much in the trade-off, these two are amazing value and together more or less invalidate Aggradons across the board. Out of the two, I tend to take the Scar-Veteran because the extra wounds and toughness are really helpful, and 215 points for that stat line is an absolute steal. Combining more things into one entry, we have Eternity Wardens, Sunbloods and Old Bloods, and right out the gate these guys all have Tearing Bite to spike their damage, and that's really about it. Of the 3, the Eternity Warden is the worst and the most expensive, and the Sunblood and Old Blood are basically the same guy, only you're paying 5 points more for more crit on that Sunblood. That is technically a good deal, and both are fine as cheap durable beaters. That doesn't make any of them particularly interesting though, but toughness 5 and 25 wounds is nice and chunky, so you can't really complain. And before I forget, we also have the Saurus Guard Alpha, who is also about as expensive, has all the same rules, mostly the same stats, only he comes with range 2 and less wounds. If you wanted 3 or 4 profiles that were almost identical, you have come to the right place, and frankly you can add in a 5th. You can throw in the Saurus Alpha here as well, who is even cheaper versions of all the above and even less durable. Massive yawn, not interested. That's just 5 guys who are all kind of doing the same thing. Moving away from boring Saurus beaters, we now have Skink Wizards in the form of the Star Priest and the Star Seer. The Star Seer is much more expensive, but it comes with fly, a longer range, a higher strength range attack, but they are slower at movement 4. If you want a cheap wizard, the Priest is absolutely fine as a leader. For 130 points is a complete steal. The Starseer is more expensive like I said, but does have some play as a cheapish long range source of powerful ranged damage. He's basically a budget Slann, although nowhere near as good. Important to note, these are still heroes. They still have access to Cold-Blooded Commander, allowing them to kill up to 3 models per turn if they get a kill earlier. They also have access to Tide of Serpent, giving them even more ranged damage output. Do be aware that the range on Tide of Serpents doesn't really mesh well with either of these Skink wizards, which is an unusual bit of design, so just bear that in mind. You might think that we are nearing the end of our Seraphon heroes list, but we are not, because now we have the Astrolith Bearer, who is awful, just straight up terrible. For 155 points, you get a good defensive line with pretty awful attack stats for the points, and his big draw, his big reason for taking him, is his healing ability, which is on a quad, and it's not all that good, and this guy is pretty much the hardest of all the misses so far. You might as well pretend the Astrolith does not exist. Despite already having 5 fast-moving Skink cavalry pieces and 5 Saurus cavalry pieces, we now have 2 more Skink fast-moving cavalry pieces in the form of the Raptadon Hunter and the Raptadon Charger Alphas. These guys are 135 to 140 points each, have 0 damage output, and are made of paper with only 14 wounds and toughness 2. But they do have movement 10, which makes them nice and fast. Do bear in mind though, unlike the other Skink lads, these guys aren't flying and they are classed as mounted, so that does slow them down quite a bit. These guys have 2 abilities, one called Nimble Retreat, which allows them to disengage from combat on a double for free, so theoretically they can escape death assuming you survived first contact, which is not likely. They also have Raptadon Tactics, which is also not all that great. Hunters get to make a bonus move action and chargers get to throw extra dice when they attack in melee, but since neither of these are all that effective, this ability falls flat. As much as I want to like the Raptadon Hunters and Chargers, I simply don't. They don't do enough. You can get much better elsewhere, and granted you'll be paying a lot more for it, but sometimes you've got to pay the points to get something that actually works on the battlefield, right? Finally, we are at the end of the hero trail. We have the Skink Alphas. These are good for one reason. These guys are cheap. At 100 to 105 points, you have the cheapest heroes the Seraphon have access to, allowing you to fill in their hero tax on the cheap and fill out everywhere else. The downside of this approach is that these heroes are made of paper and do nothing. They have no damage, no durability, and no worthwhile abilities. These are purely a way to mitigate having to buy a hero, and frankly, they probably aren't worth the hassle 9 times out of 10. Thanks for watching this far. If you like what you've seen, please consider hitting like, comment and subscribing. You can also use my Element Games affiliate link on screen now to help the channel out when buying gubbins for your next project. I also have a Patreon you can join for as little as £1 or $1 or one of your regional currencies, and this helps me continue doing what I do. Thanks to all my patrons and members who are on screen now, and without further ado, let's get on with the show. And we are back, and with the heroes out of the way, it's time to look at their fighters, their basic units, and we start with the biggest of the lads, the big lads themselves, arguably the visual draw of the Seraphon, the Kroxigor. Kroxigor come in 2 flavors, big and smashy, but with a stripe. This translates to Kroxigor for a flat 200 points and the Kroxigor Warspawned for 205. Defensively, they are identical with movement 4, toughness 5 and 25 wounds, but offensively, they are a little bit different. They both pack range 2, but the Warspawned has a 3-5-3-6 profile, and the Kroxigor has a 2-6-4-8 profile. What this typically means is that if you are taking the Kroxigor, you are spending the 30 points to bless the Kroxigor with an extra attack, bringing it all the way to 230. whereas the Warspawn can comfortably sit at its current stat line unblessed at 205. Now you can bless the Warspawn in a variety of ways, you just don't have to, and when you do, you have way more freedom as you are not locked into fixing a terrible attack stat, cheaping out and just slapping +1 crit, bringing this guy to 215 points is a pretty solid way of boosting your kill power without breaking the bank. To really get to grips with what makes them different, we have to look at their abilities. Starting with the Warspawn, we have the Spawn of Sotek, which gives the Warspawn a massive boost to its damage output for a very small price. This is a double and all you need is a minion, so a skink of some kind, either wounded or engaged in combat within 6 inches of your Warspawn. Do that and your piddly 3536 becomes a whopping 5536, and now you are a real menace on the battlefield. Considering you will likely have a couple of skinks somewhere in your warband, and having them engaged or wounded is pretty darn easy, just climb some spiky terrain and you're good to go. You can get the full benefits of this ability, get massively swole without any hassle at all. On the flip side, regular Kroxigor get brutal blows, and this ability is pretty good as well, and its activation is fairly easy to pull off. If you are within 1 inch of 2 or more enemy fighters, your Kroxigor gets additional attacks equal to half the value of the ability on their next attack action. Your basic Kroxigor can now swing in with up to 6 attacks. This is especially useful when moving into combat and swinging once, as it lets you make up for the fact that you moved in combat. It also lets you double down and put all of your power into one swing to make sure you kill one guy, leaving an action left over to kill a weaker guy later on. The biggest downside with both of these abilities is that neither of them really fix the core issue with Kroxigor, the biggest thing that holds them back from being outstanding. Sure, they are both solid damage amplifiers, but damage wasn't exactly the issue with Kroxigor. They've always had access to Onslaught anyway, so they've always had a core way to boost their damage output. No, the issue with Kroxigor and why they are not as good as their stats and cost would suggest is that they are simply too slow. At only movement 4, these guys are not getting around the board quickly. Sure, they have range 2 on their attacks, but this only gives them a 6-inch threat range, which isn't all that great. Then you have to consider the fact they don't have that many ways to mitigate that short threat range. So far, the only thing we've seen in faction is just teleporting them with a Slann, and that's really it, and that's pretty darn expensive. There's no WA equivalent to get them to move faster, there's no way to whip them to do things out of activation, or to even move them without taking allies. Kroxigor are very predictable, easily avoided, and their abilities do not help with that. Many Kroxigor players end up rushing them into combat early in an attempt to ram them down their opponent's throat and make up for this issue, but this often leads to the Kroxigor getting in over its head and then very quickly killed. Toughness 5 and 28 wounds is undeniably solid, but it can go down fast to a dedicated attempt. Most Seraphon lists will include at least 1 Kroxigor, some will take 2, some mad lads take 3. I think 3 is a bit too much. I think 3 is pushing it too far and your list suffers everywhere for doing so. But 1 or 2 is fine. 1 I think is the perfect number though. They are undeniably good, they are just lacking a lot of the utility tools that many other top tier beaters at their points level have access to. Compared to Rat Ogres, Annihilators, Paladins, Mega Bosses, even Vexmore, they don't quite land. Taking more than 1, more than 2 at a stretch, and you're just not going to have a good time. With Kroxigors out of the way, we move on to Aggradons, only this time without the hero rune mark, and we have 2 club and spear variants again. One has range 2 and more crit, and the other has more flat damage. They are both fast, they are both mounted, and both decently durable, and they come in at 185 and 180 points, and I don't like either of them. For me, they don't do enough damage and they aren't durable enough to do what I want to do with my cavalry pieces. I like to ram my cavalry into their turn 2 deployment and force my opponent to deal with them, and toughness 4 20 wounds doesn't really cut it all that much, especially when their damage output is really unreliable thanks to that low attack stat and that fairly middling strength. Sure, you can use Tearing Bite, and Tearing Bite is fantastic, but with only 3 attacks, you aren't getting enough bang for your buck, and frankly there are just better options elsewhere, both more expensive and cheaper. In short, these guys are just not making the cut. In a similar vein, Pterodon riders with javelins or bolas are almost fine. I wasn't a fan of the hero Pterodons because they didn't do enough and they were quite expensive for what you got. Pterodons are still expensive and they still don't do all that much in terms of raw damage output, but at 170 points they are a reasonable flyer and they can do your usual flying shenanigans. Their biggest weakness is that they are toughness 3 with only 15 wounds, which means they can be taken out very quickly, and that is not ideal. Swiftly moving on to Ripidactyls, and these lads have more toughness but they are slightly slower, and unlike their hero variants they go from attacks 4 to attacks 3, which is actually pretty darn substantial, and the loss of their hero rune mark means they lose access to Cold-Blooded Commander, which means they aren't fulfilling the chaff killing harassment role that I enjoy so much with the Alpha and the Chief. They may be 50 points cheaper, but you are losing a lot in those 50 points, and I don't think Ripidactyls like Pterodons are really worth it in the end. What I would take, however, is the Saurus Knight. These guys come in 2 variants, Spear and Awful, so stick to the Spear. Range 2, 4424, movement 6, predatory leap, toughness 4 and 20 wounds for only 165 points. These guys are cheap, they are fast, they are durable enough for their cost, and they are an ideal target for Tearing Bite because they have that beautiful 4 attacks. If you want cavalry on the cheap, Saurus Knights are by far and away superior to Aggradon riders, who have less attacks, less damage output, they cost more, and have the same abilities. Granted, the Aggradons are slightly faster, but that's just not a big enough bonus to ignore all the other things that Saurus Knights do better. What it boils down to, and I've said this before, you either take something more expensive than Aggradon riders, or you take a Saurus Knight. Those are your only options, really. Bundling the next 3 together, we have Razordons, Salamanders, and the Spawn of Chotek. Defensively, they are all slightly different, which is kind of annoying, with the Spawn being the most durable and the others being slightly less so in different ways. Offensively, they are very different though. Razordons have a long range, a high volume of shots and very low damage. Salamanders are mid-range, low volume, high damage, and to mix things up, the Spawn of Chotek packs a restrictive range due to having a minimum range, low volume, and low damage, which frankly means the Spawn of Chotek is just bad. Salamanders and Razordons might be slightly squishier and slightly more expensive, but they hit far harder, or at the very least, are far more interesting. Out of them all, the Salamander, in my opinion, is the best. At 135 points, you are getting a very dangerous ranged combatant who moves quickly and can't be tied up in combat since it can fire its range attack into combat thanks to having no minimum range. Them all being beasts means you can synergize them with Skink handlers, which allows them to attack again on doubles, allowing you to fire 3 or 4 times a turn, especially on that Salamander, is outstanding. Launching 2, 4, 6 or even 8 strength 4, 3 damage shots per turn is pretty darn snazzy and worth thinking about when you list build. If you want to get a little bit crazy, this also works on the Razordon, being able to fire 5, 10, 15 or even 20 shots a turn at 12-inch range, even with low damage and low strength, is pretty darn handy just for blending through chaff. That's a lot of dice being thrown, you will roll those crits and crit 3 will do enough to blend through a lot of things. That being said though, the Razordon really does come as more of a gimmick and the Salamander feels like an actual solid piece you would want to take in your lists. And a key thing to note as well is that the handlers are only 65 points, which is your cheapest model in the whole warband, and you need chaff anyway, so it's not a bad deal to take a Salamander and a handler because half of that has already been taken. Saurus Guard are up next, and they are not really good enough. For 120 points you get movement 4, toughness 5 and wounds 15, range 2, 3, 4, 2, 4, and on paper it's not bad. It's a solid enough profile that competes with other mid-range units in other warbands like boiz. That being said though, you are paying a premium for higher movement, better defenses thanks to their reaction, range 2, tearing, bite, and that premium makes them a hard sell. At 120 points you are starting to compete with Stormcast mid-range, and these guys don't come out on top when you start making that comparison. I will get to them in a little bit, but these lads don't add enough to the basic Saurus warrior for this price hike. In this case, you are likely looking to keep things on the cheaper end of the scale and not invest so many points in your big chunky mid-range. Technically, the next thing I should talk about is the Raptadon Chargers and Hunters, but I am not going to because, like their hero variants, they really are not worth talking about. They are too squishy, they don't do enough damage. Take basically anything else, you are good to go. Saurus Warriors on the other hand, whoo boy, you get 2 variants of Saurus, Club and Spear, and the best version is by far the Club. You lose a little bit of crit, but you gain a whole extra attack, and you spend 85 points instead of 90, which is a steal. At 85 points, Saurus are really good. 4-4-1-3 is a beefy melee profile that can blend through chaff. Movement 4, toughness 4 and 12 wounds is durable enough to take a hit. Their reaction helps them tank way more than they should, and thanks to their attacks 4, they are amazing tearing bite targets. Most stuff in Seraphon that is good in combat doesn't really need tearing bite. They have enough raw damage to do well on their own, and tearing bite is an optional bonus to really help power through those really big things. What Saurus do is make nearly every single model in your warband a potential murder hobo. A Saurus going from 4-4-1-3 to a 4-4-7-9 is disgusting. They are a real threat that your opponent has to consider constantly. Keeping your cards close to your chest as to when and where you will pop tearing bite is highly advised and a key way to play Seraphon. Just know that Saurus are up there as one of the best targets for this ability. Beyond that, run around, tank hits, eat chaff, and have a good time. These guys are wonderfully reliable. Finally, we have Skinks, and I have already went over handlers, so I am going to skip them this time. We are left with Bolt Spitters and Buckler variants, and of the two, you will take the Buckler. For 65 points, you get movement 6, toughness 3, wounds 8, and a 3-2-1-3 profile, which is not great, but it's fast, it buffs your Warspawn, and they will forever annoy your opponent when it comes to objective games because movement 6 is crazy fast. These guys can cross half the board in an instant, letting you mess with people all game long. These are great filler pieces to add numbers to your warband when you can't fit in that extra Saurus. Now, I don't normally go over Bladebone in these videos, but I am this time because the Starblood Stalkers are actually really good, and I've already done so much I might as well finish the job. Starting with Kroxigor, this guy leads the group, and Kroxigor is arguably the best leader in the entire warband. For only 130 points, you are getting movement 6, toughness 3, and 18 wounds. This guy is a fully fledged wizard with the minion rune mark, which is important because his combos with your Warspawn. For the same price as a regular Skink priest, you are getting way more damage, even if you lose out on Titus Serpents. But this isn't really a big deal because you gain your own unique ability called Imbue with Azerite Energy. This is a triple that adds +1 movement and +1 toughness to all friendly fighters within 9 inches. This is fantastic on basically everything because Seraphon tend to hover around that toughness 4 with a few toughness 5 models. Boosting them all to toughness 5 and making those toughness 5s toughness 6 makes your warband far harder to shift. But the real seller is the movement. A large AoE that elevates all your average movement 4 guys to a fast moving movement 5 guy who can in turn still burn a rush to go even faster. Your guys can just get around the board. Those Kroxigor who are hanging around with their 6-inch threat ranges, well now they're rocking 8 inches of threat. and now you can better leverage your killer offensive stats. As an ally, Kroxigor is also amazing outside of Seraphon. Cheap, cheery, good damage output, and a great ability. Just what's not to like? It also helps that Kroxigor opens up the rest of the Blade-Born warbands when taken as an ally, and his warband is one of the best. Klaktrok is up next, and despite being another Old Blood variant, Klaktrok is somewhat interesting because this lad isn't a hero. This has a lot of value in certain kill missions as he is more free to go off and die than the Old Blood, but also he has more wounds than Old Bloods and Sunbloods, so he's a bit more durable. He does lose out on Cold Blood Commander, and that is a pretty big hit, but he isn't too shabby if you just want a durable smashy beater. Out of the whole bunch, Huachi is probably the biggest loser here. For 95 points you get a bad range attack, a bad melee attack, and he's just not really worth the investment. He is one of the tougher skinks, he's just not worth it when for 10 points less, you can just take a Saurus. Otterpaddle and Tok, on the other hand, are very much worth it. Both are nightmares to deal with because these skinks can do a lot of damage, a rare thing for a skink. They both have 12-inch range attacks, with Otterpaddle being a 2-3-1-5 and Tok being a 2-3-1-4. Sure, you might be crit fishing like crazy, but when you land those 6s, your opponent's really going to feel those crit 4s and those crit 5s. At only 80 points a pop, they are great as they can do everything you want with a skink, namely run around and just be a pain in the butt, but they can also deal solid damage in a pinch, and Otterpaddle has access to Chameleon Ambush. This is a double that grants a bonus move action provided Otterpaddle isn't within 12 inches of an enemy. This means Otterpaddle can run up to 18 inches a turn, which is great. Not to mention you can use Chameleon Ambush to take Otterpaddle, move him into range for free, and then fire your blowpipe twice with both your remaining actions, which is a good way to try and bait out those cheeky crit 5s. Finally, we move on to Zepik, and Zepik is just a cheap skink who is good-ish in melee. The draw here is the low price and the toughness 3 with that 10 wounds. If you can't afford a Saurus, you will likely take a Zepik. If you can't afford a Zepik, you will just take a regular skink. He's fine, a common inclusion, just not as interesting or as useful as Otterpaddle, Tok, or frankly even Klaktrok. And there we have it, a full rundown of Seraphon and their endless redundancy. Seraphon are a great example of why the compendium needs a little bit of work. When you have a grand total of like 21 cavalry pieces and 7 leaders who all do the same thing, you know you can cut some fat. Seraphon aren't the only compendium faction with this issue, but since their update, they've become one of the most egregious in that area. But cut through all that fat and you have yourself an incredibly capable warband that can terrorize the competitive scene. They do lack some internal support like universal action generation and control mechanics like nets, but they have some fantastic big guys, small guys and middle guys that allows them to compete in just about any mission, in just about any pack, not to mention access to an amazing lineup of Order allies if you go down that route. If you are looking to make a competitive list for Seraphon, you have so many options when it comes to doing just that. In this section, I'm going to throw a list badoosh that I have just cobbled together. It is a Slann with +1 strength, a Kroxigor with +1 attack, 3 Saurus with club, Otterpaddle, Tok, and a handler. You have the range of the Slann, the kill power of the Kroxigor, the flexibility of the Saurus, the speed of Otterpaddle and Tok, and a handler for good measure. You are rocking an 8-man warband and you'll have a good time in most missions as a result. As always, this is not a perfectly optimized list, so I advise you to take this as a starting off point and then use it as a jumping off block to make your own list in the future. And with that, that's the end of the video. If you made it this far, then thanks for watching, and I hope this was somewhat helpful in starting your Seraphon journey. If you liked what you saw, please consider leaving a like, a comment, and subscribing. And until next time, lads, ladies, and everybody in between and beyond, ta-ra. Welcome to the post-toast credits. A massive shout out to all of my patrons and members, but an extra big shout out to my algorithmic demon slayers, Andy Morris, Blah Blah Blah, Brioche, the Head Knight of Paint, Heinz D, Lord Fireaxe, Maps, Sable Saver, Steve Bean, the Houston Toad, and Velas. Thank you all for continuing to support this shit show of a channel, and I'll catch you all next time.